I've been invisible for 8 months. Not in the way you imagine. No cloak of anonymity, no secret identity. Invisible in the way the house regarded me. I moved through polished rooms like a slow tide, smoothing, stacking, returning objects to their prescribed angles until whatever trace of my passing was the faintest thumbprint on a silver tray. The mansion expected certain sounds, the quiet whir of a vacuum, the whisper of linens being folded, the careful click of porcelain being returned to its place, and nobody noticed the person who made them. That invisibility kept my hands steady and the bills paid. There were mornings when marble felt like another country. I would step off the subway, the world below still wet from the night, smell of steam and fried food, and something sharp and metallic that belonged to the trains. Then I'd climb the stoop to the house and fall into a different weather. Lemon-scented cleaners, the chill of a tile floor underfoot, carpets that swallowed footsteps. Silk curtains softened the city's hard wind into a hush. When I switched on the chandeliers, I turned light into something obedient. I worked for Giovanni Moretti. The name is the sort of thing that can make your pulse slow. His house sat on the kind of avenue lined with plane trees and black iron fences. His paintings were heavy with gilt. His staff moved like parts of a clock. Giovanni himself was not a presence you stumbled into. He was an architecture of silence, a client who appeared and left, and made the house adjust without fanfare. People said he had inherited the right to be cold. I decided long ago not to notice the stories that drifted between staff rooms. Stories told in half smiles, in warnings prefaced with, "Mind you." I had stories of my own. My mother's bills sat in a cardboard shoebox under my bed. They were posted in neat stacks, chemotherapy cycles, an MRI with an itemized code that meant nothing until it meant everything, last year's surgery that had been more hope than cure. The totals blurred into one number for me, heavy like an animal, $47,000. I said it to myself in the subway when the car rocked. $47,000 in monthly payments and medical forms and people on the phone who pronounced my name wrong and then asked for more. I did the math on napkins between shifts. At $2 extra an hour in overtime, my life became an exercise in inches. A few more shifts, a small freelance cleaning job for an elderly neighbor, a refusal to eat out for a month. My sister Brittany worked in the mansion's kitchen. She cooked like she could mend wishes with time. We were both careful. The work itself was a litany I could recite without thinking. Dusting the library, the procedure, top shelf to bottom, silver polishing in a bowl of warm water, folding shirts the way the house expected, ironing collars so they stood like quiet soldiers. I learned the grain of every table in the place, the hidden drawers, the one key that opened the study. I learned where not to look. In a house like that, looking wrong could be a mistake. On Thursdays, I took a different train, less crowded, and walked a block with my uniform rolled into a canvas bag. Rain the night of the mugging came sudden and flat, the city slickening into mirrors. I left late, wet hair tucked into my hood, the bag heavy with a linen set and attitude. On the subway, I rehearsed the list of things I would say to the agency if the agency called about overtime. I rehearsed Nicole's name, the woman from billing at the hospital who promised to call. My hands were numb with cold and with the calculation of money. They found me on a side street, where the light failed to reach the pavement properly. At first it was a shadow, and then a voice, low and casual. I had my head down, hands in my pockets. The men moved like a corner in the city had given them permission to be cruel. One of them reached for my canvas bag. When I tried to keep my grip, the world tilted. There's a particular sound fear makes in your chest, sharp and quick, like free metal, that I remember more vividly than the faces. When they saw the uniform, something in them brightened. The recognition was like a key being turned. The mood changed from opportunism to territory. Voices sharpened. I learned then how much danger sits inside a glance. They took my phone and some cash. They took my coat. The beating was quick and stupid and enormous in its smallness, hands in boots and an elbow that dug into my ribs when I fell. I tasted iron, the damp of rain mixed with the warmth of blood. My jaw unclipped like a hinge and my knees hit pavement that smelled of old food and dog urine. Someone laughed, angry and brittle. A voice said something in a language I couldn't place, maybe a Croatian name, and then the world narrowed to the thin, bright pain in my side and the need to breathe. I did not scream. I had learned in other ways to make myself small enough to be passed over. Instead, I counted breaths. When they walked away, one of them spat toward me and the city swallowed his boots. I crawled into a doorway and waited for my heart to slow, for shame to be less physical. When I got up, I found my hands sticky, my uniform torn, a shoe missing a lace. I pulled myself together as best I could and walked home like I had somewhere else to be. At the apartment, Brittany opened the door before I could knock. Her face, in the long light of our kitchen, registered 100 small things. The wet of my hair, the bruise collecting at my eye, the way my shoulders had chosen to hunch. Dinner burned on the stove and the radio fuzzed in the corner. Brittany reached for me and hesitated. It was the hesitation that told me her mind was cataloging options. Doctor, police, a call to our mother. We had learned to negotiate crises with the smooth efficiency of people who had had too many of them. I'm the only one who knows how to get through the drawers in that house, I lied. It came out too sharp. My voice sounded like a stranger's in my ears. I mended it into a story about slipping on the subway stairs, about a wardrobe malfunction. She watched the lie fold into itself. There was that brief, awful moment when your sister becomes your mirror and refuses to hold the reflection you want. I did not go to the police. Not because I believed in silence for some martyrdom, but because silence was arithmetic. A night in a holding cell could mean a missed shift, a missed paycheck, a memo in the morning about how inconvenienced the house was. The people who had most power in my life, my mother's oncologist, the hospital financial clerk, required every penny we could hold. I had decided, long before that night, that I would not place a single stumbling block between those payments and our bills. Instead, I wrapped my face in ice packs and went to work the next day. There is something obscene about dusting a mantle when your cheekbones are a map of bruises. I kept my head down, vacuuming the Persian runner as if the noise of the machine could push out the memory. Rosa, the head housekeeper, saw me. Rosa had been at the mansion longer than anyone. Her face was an unreadable ledger, the kind women develop who have watched the same 1,000 small dramas play out behind closed doors. She did not ask, but her eyes did not look away. At the hospital, Dr. Caruso was efficient and blunt. He pressed light into the hollows of my ribs and moved on to the x-rays with the kind of focus that suggests he had done it all 1,000 times. It was healing-minded observation. He gave me stitches for the split lip, a bandage for my shoulder, and the kind of look that tried to weigh whether to push for police involvement or not. The x-ray showed a hairline fracture in my right rib. He told me to take painkillers sparingly, to give it 6 weeks, no heavy lifting, no overtime. I nodded and wrote the prescription down as if it were the name of a small, helpful god. I did the sums again in the sterile quiet of the clinic waiting room. 6 weeks off work meant an impossibility for our debts. My mother's shoebox of bills hovered in my head like a judgment. I tasted guilt as stubbornly as iron. That night I slept with the heating low and the humidity higher than in the mansion, and the city's sound made the apartment feel like a living thing, a constant, worrying motion. When Giovanni first asked me about the bruises, he did it the way people who have power ask things, without drama, but with an authority that made every person in the room stand straighter. The room he asked it in was his study, a place of measured dark and books that smelled faintly of citrus and leather. He was not a man of bursts. He was more like the law his name implied, an assertion that things would settle into the pattern he chose. I had been called in to tidy his desk after dinner. Rosa told me to be careful around the papers. Franco hovered near the doorway, a silhouette in a tailored suit who watched rather than moved. Giovanni emerged from his private wing without fanfare. He was taller than his photograph suggested, and when he looked at me, it was as if he was cataloging what would matter later. The limp in my step, the way my collar pulled against the bruise near my jaw. He did not touch me. He asked in a voice that made the lamps defer, "What happened?" I started with the lie rehearsed on the subway. Stare, slip, subway. The truth stuck in me like a bone. It is strange how some truths will not move. That night they were lodged like a splinter. He listened without the expression of interest the rich give when they are amused by your misfortune. Instead, a certain careful attention arrived, like a man studying a broken instrument to know whether it could be tuned. "Who did this?" he asked, and the way he said it made the room change temperature. It was not simply a question about the men on the street. The house seemed to inhale. The question carried weight and claim. It became something that hovered between us. An accusation at a system. A demand for answerability. It was the kind of question that unmade the calculation I had been living inside. The one where my silence preserved my wages. Where my autonomy was a daily transaction. His voice softened a hair. There was nothing performative in him. When Giovanni made a query, he expected a ledger. I wanted to tell him I had chosen silence. I wanted to tell him about the shoebox, about the chemotherapy, about conversations with the hospital billing clerk, where names were spoken like currencies. I wanted to tell him how impossible it felt to go to prison for one night when our debts were waiting like hungry dogs. Instead, I said, "Some guys, on the street." He did not accept that. He sat back and did what gentility does when it is a veneer for surveillance. He reached for the remote and dialed into the house's security. We watched my own humiliation in the glow of the study's largest screen as a playback resolved into nights and alleys. The footage was grainy and cold. It magnified every small betrayal of movement. I did not want to watch myself fail. I watched anyway, bare where they had made me so. Franco did not need to be asked. He watched the footage with a professional stillness, muttering only when images matched faces he knew. The names he spoke were like bitter pills. Darren Cole, a known muscle for a crew across town. Victor, a man as blunt as his name suggested. Giovanni's eyes had the flare of a man measuring his chessboard. "You should have gone to the police," Giovanni said, not as a command exactly, but like a foreman rating a job done poorly. His anger was not theatrical. It was the quiet kind that reorients a room. "You should have called Rosa. You should have come to me." Rosa, who had been watching from the doorway with her hands folded, stepped forward slowly. "She was trying to protect her job, signore," she said, and in her voice was a history of women tucking hard truths into their linens. Giovanni's question, "Who did this?" was not an end. It opened the space for something to move. His attention fell on Franco like a brief flare of trust. Franco said nothing for a long time, and then, as if moving a piece on a board, left the room to do what he did best, turn a suspicion into information. They offered me a room in the house that night. I remembered the offer with the odd clarity of remembered calculations. What it would mean to be safe, and what it would mean to be visible in a different way. Safety in that house was a currency with its own clauses. To accept it was to swap one set of constraints for another. Outside, the city was a machine that ground people down by chance. Inside, the mansion was a machine that did it by design. I hesitated. My reflex was to say no. I told them I had an apartment, that Brittany depended on the job's pay. Giovanni watched me with those eyes that seemed to understand contracts without paper. He said, "You don't have to decide tonight." But he did not need me to decide. His men were already making notes in the margins of the night. That night, I slept in a bed whose sheets smelled faintly of lavender and money. It was the most expensive hush I had ever known. The bed was large enough to float in, and the house folded around me like a family that did not ask for your secrets, but had ways of learning them. I lay awake thinking of my mother and the shoebox, and the x-ray with the small fracture, and the surgeon's bland instructions. I thought about the men on the street, and how, in their eyes, they had not seen a person but a uniform. The way the world often mistakes work for identity, and punishes the body that serves it. When I woke in the morning, Giovanni had left a tray at the foot of the bed, tea, a small soft roll, a note folded like a promise. He did not add anything more. His method was not generosity shouted. It was a tidy and exacting thing. I kept my distance as if distance itself could be a border I controlled. I went through my tasks in the house, but with a new audience. Where before rooms had been barren of consequence, now every movement had an invisible witness. Walls, once a background, now contained attention. The staff registered my presence in a different way. Rosa offered me extra bandages and a look that held both sympathy and warning. Brittany cooked for me in shifts, her face a map of worry and pragmatism when she came over. Franco watched me less like a stranger and more like something that belonged to a ledger he wanted to balance. There was a particular moment in the kitchen when Giovanni walked in and stood in the doorway like a punctuation. He had been in Naples as a child, Rosa said once, and had learned to measure the world by the lines of its buildings. He spoke rarely of that life, but a quiet mention of the sea came up sometimes over coffee, and when it did, his voice tightened in a way that made him look younger. For all his layers, for all the quiet authority, there were small fissures that let you see something fragile, like an old photograph tucked into a wallet. One night he told me, briefly, about a funeral where the man expected to lead a line of mourners had not been prepared to be alone. The confession landed like an instrument readied for a chord. I started to sleep in a spare room near the library. It was lightless and cool, with books stacked like barricades. They called it a guest room, though I wondered who their guests usually were. The walls were painted a color that suggested money's idea of comfort, stone and restraint. I told myself it was temporary. I wanted to keep the arithmetic of it in my head. 6 weeks of rest, the fracture knitting, the bills in the shoebox that would be a small and cheery line in some ledger if I could just make it. My autonomy felt compressed, like a coin placed into a narrow slot. It could still be used, but only in certain ways. Giovanni was careful, and that carefulness was its own kind of pressure. The house taught me a new timidity. My hands moved over furniture differently because they were now being watched for the quality of their touch. There was comfort in the attentions. Someone would bring me hot tea. Someone else would check whether my wounds had scabbed cleanly. But comfort that looked like surveillance made me think of cages that were velvet-lined. Every night my mind returned to the footage, to the faces that had recognized my uniform, and lit up at the thought of taking something. I thought of the men's laughter and the rhythm of their voices. Who did this? Had a crookedness to it. It suggested an answer that would not be simple. I was balancing the calculus of survival on a thin wire. Refuse Giovanni's help and remain small and self-sufficient and subject to the city's randomness, or accept his shelter and enter another set of obligations where my body might become a symbol of something I had not consented to be. I found myself watching Giovanni in the margins of the house. He was not theatrical in his control. He moved through the rooms like someone who had been taught to put things in order, so they did not have to explain themselves later. There were family portraits sometimes, a photograph of a woman in Naples that softened his mouth for a second. Franco's loyalty was evident in little ways. The way he spoke of men with names that made other people's hairs stand on end. The way he closed a door. Rosa watched the perimeter of my life with the caution of someone who had seen what the house could do to people's choices. One afternoon, when the sky was a wash of pale winter, and the mansion's library seemed like a planet of its own, Giovanni sat across from me with a cup of coffee that had been made to be consumed slowly. He asked me to tell him about my mother. The question was not cruel. It was a concession to human exchange. It was the beginning of something that might become understanding. I told him about my mother's first diagnosis, about how the smell of antiseptic had started to cling to our laundry like a second skin. I told him how hospital bills had multiplied like mushrooms after rain, how a simple trip to the ER had been an economic earthquake. As I spoke, I measured my sentences for risk. To tell him everything would have been a kind of nakedness I could not afford, but to keep it all back was to be dishonest in a way that did not sit with me. He listened with the kind of stillness that makes you say things you had been saving. He did not offer platitudes. He asked questions that were precise and centered on facts. What debts? What names? Who handled the payments? He did not ask because he wanted to own the answers. He asked because he weighed possibilities like a man assessing whether he could protect something he had decided to value. The evening the footage showed the men's faces clearly. The house had a different sound. It was as if the mansion had been waiting for this moment, muscles tensing for movement. Franco returned with news that was not a narrative, but a ledger update. He gave names and neighborhoods and the kind of shorthand that meant piles of people who measured and moved their own power. Giovanni did not flinch. He listened and then asked the question again, though now the tone held less curiosity and more like a blade. Who did this? It had become not only a demand for identification but an ownership voiced. Who set you against us? Who thought they could take you and not be answered for it? My answer that night was a small, truth-torn thing. I told him the men's names as best as I could piece them from the footage. Saying the names felt like pronouncing an incantation. A new world rearranged itself around those syllables. Saying the names meant that my fate was no longer only mine to calculate. It meant I had invited someone with his own resources to take an interest. When the question hung in the room, there was a moment that tasted of metal and expectation. No one promised me a perfect world. No one promised I would not be watched. No one promised that the men who had hit me would not make other choices that would challenge the balance of what the house protected. But something in Giovanni's way of asking made a promise that had its own gravity, that someone was going to answer. I closed that night with the shoebox under my pillow and the house around me, and the question, who did this? Like a stone in my pocket. It was a fulcrum, a lever, a thing that could move other things if pressure was applied. I did not yet know whether that movement would be to my favor or not. I only knew that the silence I had chosen for arithmetic and survival had been breached, and the breach had introduced a new player into the ledger of my life. The days that followed felt like living inside a slow, deliberate machine. Once the question had been asked, who did this? The house rearranged itself around its answer. It was as if Giovanni had opened a ledger, and every margin was suddenly filled. Franco moved through the rooms with the economy of a man who could translate suspicion into action. Rosa began to check in on me with a regularity that felt like prayer. Brittany came by more often. Her brow knotted into one tight, practical line the way she held a saucepan. My world, already a thin arithmetic between bills and shifts, slid into a new calculus where attention replaced anonymity, and every kindness had an edge. Franco gave me updates that were partial and precise, the kind of information you receive when you are not meant to possess the whole picture. He told me where the men had been seen last, an intersection, a storefront with flickering neon, and he gave me names with the clipped cadence of someone reading stock tickers. Darren Cole, Victor, he said once, and I felt the syllables land like small stones. Franco never looked at me the way others did. He looked as if he might mentally sculpt what had happened into an explanation. There was respect there, but also the professional cool of someone for whom violence was a tool, not a tragedy. The house's security footage had given them what we knew. The grainy clip had captured my fall, the kick of a boot, the hands that turned what could have been a mugging into something sharper. In another room, old files lay open on a desk, where an analyst from Giovanni's side cross-referenced faces with records. It was not a public thing. It was the private machinery of a private world, where disputes were resolved like accounts. Word moved through the city in a different current. By morning there were whispers, an alley conversation about men who were last seen in certain neighborhoods. Small businesses on the wrong side of those neighborhoods closed for a day or two. Proprietors shuttered their doors not because the law had intervened, but because they feared the ripple of attention. Fear is its own authority. It asks for no warrant. And then something happened that put a halt to the arithmetic of my life. The men who had hurt me were taken. I did not watch it happen. The act of retribution rarely accommodates an audience. Instead, it arrived in echoes. A phone call to Rosa at dawn. Hushed voices in the staff room. A car that did not belong to the house idling on the avenue for an hour. Franco came back with a fold of paper in his hand and the expression of a man who had completed a task and was already thinking about the next one. He told me, without relish, that the men had been found where they had been seen, and that they would no longer be able to work the neighborhoods they used to. His words were careful, as if saying more might split the air. There was a heat to the house that night, an edge of invisible things settling into place. I slept poorly, waking to the old city sounds that never truly left. The distant rumble of a subway, a siren that could have been 100 things. When I left the house for my apartment a week later, the city had picked up a new tone. People crossed the street to avoid certain blocks. A deli that had once been open late now closed at dusk. The papers had nothing substantial, only a rumor or two about increased rivalry, and a shift in territory. They were careful. Newspapers could be foolish in their certainties. Fear, however, was a fact you could smell. I watched the consequences as a spectator and as a participant. The men who had hurt me did not crawl into the narratives of any court. They were answered for in a language the law does not always speak aloud. I felt an almost immediate moral recoil. Was I complicit by being the thing that prompted action? Did I owe them a voice beyond the bruises on my skin? I wrestled with that at night. The house offered me safety, but it also offered me a role in a process I had not chosen fully. My autonomy felt tangled. Giovanni, for his part, seemed to measure all of this with the same steady hand he used to press a napkin into a fold. He did not boast. He did not parade results. Instead, he made small arrangements that looked more like care than conquest. When I objected to staying, when I said I could go back to my apartment, that Brittany and I could rearrange our budget somehow, he listened, and then he made offers in a way that was never brusque or imperious. He set conditions like a man laying down rules for a delicate instrument: quiet, discreet security checks, a driver who would shadow my usual walk home some nights, a nurse who could come in for the follow-up visits. The nurse was a small detail that mattered. Dr. Caruso had said 6 weeks. Stitches and a hairline fracture needed time and respect. The nurse's visits turned the house into a clinic for a few afternoons. Bandages changed, a heat pack applied, someone to measure pain and to note if my breathing caught. There were exercises to do that felt ridiculous at first. Slow breaths, small lifts of my arm. But the patience they required taught me to be kinder to the body I had learned to dismiss in the name of survival. I went back to the clinic for a follow-up x-ray. Standing in the corridor, the cold tiles underfoot and radio talking about a weather front, I kept my scarf tight. The machine made an odd clinical hum. Dr. Caruso entered with his usual professional detachment, but the look that passed between us was softer than it had been. The fracture had mended enough for modest weight-bearing. He explained that in 6 weeks I would be able to resume more vigorous work. He reminded me, gently, of the importance of rest. "It's not weakness to heal," he said. "It's how you protect the body to keep walking." His words were practical and small, but I tucked them into myself like a seed. Back at the mansion, my life resumed its rituals with new actors. There were small kindnesses from people who were learning to regard me as someone the house had decided to value, rather than a functionary of it. Giovanni would sometimes appear with a cup of tea and nothing more, standing in the doorway as if offering a punctuation. Once he brought a wrapped loaf of bread from a bakery he said he liked in Naples, and the bread's outside was a thin, crackling story. When he offered it, it was like a relic of the living world he rarely spoke about. It was during this slow tenure of care that things between us moved in a different register. There were conversations that began as practicalities. How I liked my tea, the weird way I folded kitchen towels, and ended in small revelations. He told me, one evening as rain rattled the panes, about Naples and the way the city stitched itself along the sea. He spoke of a funeral that had been a lesson in loneliness, about a father who had been both a protector and a man who taught a boy to measure risk. His language for it was economical. He did not fix the past into a tableau. He merely handed me scraps. I told him about my mother more fully than I had before. The first scare, the chemo sessions that made her hair fall out in clumps that we swept into a paper bag like a private harvest, the nights at the hospital when I slept in a hard chair and imagined the bin of bills growing teeth. I admitted, with something like relief, that sometimes I resented the house for its indifference, because at least indifference required no loyalty. This admission, terrible as it felt, was not met with the kind of pity I had feared. He listened, and when he responded, it felt less like an answer and more like an exchange. "You don't have to be invisible," he said once, in the library where the lamp made a crescent of light over the table. I had no scripted response for a sentence like that. It sounded like possibility. It sounded dangerous. The slow-burn tenderness that threaded through those days was not a conflagration. There were no grand declarations. There were, instead, gestures. A hand pressed lightly to the small of my back as he guided me down the marble stairs. A cup of tea left for me when the house was asleep. A folded note with a line from an old song in Italian that made no sense until later when I looked up the translation. He had a way with small things that felt like recalibration. Consent never felt assumed. He was careful in a way that had a rigor to it. He would ask if it was all right to enter my room when he felt the urge to, and he respected my answer when I said no. When our conversations grew more intimate, he did not step over my limits. He offered protection without announcing ownership. That distinction mattered, because it is one thing to save someone, and another to own the salvage. The first honest moment between us, the one people like to call a turning point, came late one night in the library when I had been folding a stack of napkins. The house had that hush that comes when everyone is asleep and the city seems to inhale. He sat across from me with his cup and watched the way my hands moved. "You are not built to be small," he said, as if making an observation about a machine. It arrived without flourish, and yet carried in it an implicit indictment of every place I had ever served. I felt something heat in my chest. Anger, perhaps, at the truth of it. Gratitude, perhaps, at someone else giving that truth voice. I put the napkins down and met his gaze. "What would I be then?" I asked. "A person who decides," he said. That night, our closeness became a negotiation. There was a kiss in the library later, as natural and inevitable as breathing, but also deliberate. He kissed me carefully, as if checking a map. I did not return readily at first. My body had not been given permission to trust. He stayed patient, his hands gentle on my shoulders, giving me time to move forward on my own. When I did, it was because an interior something had authorized it, not because his power had made the direction of my heart ambiguous. Consent was a thing we built line by line. After that, boundaries were discussed with the bluntness of accountants. I insisted on keeping my apartment. I refused to be sequestered as though my presence were a totem that entitled him to absolute control. Brittany would not leave her kitchen job, and she would not be moved without her say. I wanted security measures that were discreet. No armored cars or bodyguards that would announce me like a trophy. I wanted to be able to work, to enter the world that had been the source of my money and identity, albeit a precarious one. Giovanni listened. He made his counteroffers. A stipend to pay for medical leave for those 6 weeks. A salaried position if I wanted to take it later. An accountant to contact the hospital and negotiate payments. He gave me space to speak and the resources to decide. When he transferred the funds to the hospital to clear the immediate debt, I remember thinking it would feel like charity, and it did not. It felt instead like a practical solution, a way of closing one ledger and opening another. I told him I would consider the job offer. He said nothing but left a pen on the desk between us, an invitation to write. Not everything that followed was gentle. News moved through the city like a current that altered moods. The rival leader, Arben Krasniki, was not a man to be provoked, and to ignore the provocation might look like weakness. Word reached the house that he had dispatched men to make inquiries, routine tests of reaction, and that his people had been rattled by the sudden unavailability of certain men in their roster. He called at one point through channels, the sort of diplomatic call one makes to test boundaries. His tone was polite, but it carried the undertone of a neighborhood association, negotiating the terms of keeping a watchful eye over territory. Giovanni handled it the way he handled most things, with strategy. He refused to escalate into public spectacle. He brokered, through intermediaries, a meeting with Krasniki's envoy in a discreet restaurant where the lighting was forgiving and the servers practiced neutrality like a religion. I was not meant to be there, and yet I found myself at the house that evening holding the roasted end of a loaf and watching Giovanni prepare to leave. I told him I did not want to be a pawn. He answered with a look that contained the gravity of someone who knew the chessboard, but did not underestimate the cost to the pieces. The night of the meeting, the house felt like a temple. Rosa moved like a quiet priestess, preparing trays that smelled of herbs and citrus. Franco's suit was immaculate. He wore the expression of someone who had rehearsed the words one should not say. They left me behind in the library, where the fire gave off a measured warmth. Afterward, Giovanni came back with the air of a man who had closed a door without slamming it. The meeting had not been theatrical. There were no shouted ultimatums or drawn blades. Instead, there had been a conversation about borders, about understandings that must be respected. Krasniki had made a demand that Giovanni resist, a public retraction, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that would have made the house publicly beholden. Giovanni refused. He offered, instead, a different kind of concession: restraint. He would not expand. He would not authorize actions that would make the neighborhoods worse. It was a pragmatic decision that would cost him something, and perhaps buy him a measure of peace. Krasniki did not appreciate being told no. He sent a warning that was a small, cruel performance. A car left idling near the house with tinted windows. 2 men who watched the gates for a single afternoon. It was a reminder that the city's logic was not entirely under one roof. Giovanni did not flinch. He tightened the net of discretion around me, moved me to the guest room that had always felt like an odd kind of sanctuary, and told Franco to keep an eye on the perimeter. He called his people to remind them of old rules. They obeyed with the kind of obedience that comes from respect rather than fear. There was a point, somewhere in the middle of this, where I had to make a choice that felt less like surrender and more like authorship. Giovanni offered me a job as his personal assistant. It was a salaried position with benefits, something I had never imagined for myself. The job carried its own oddities, being near him in a professional capacity where each glance could be measured and misread. I asked for a contract that protected my right to my apartment, to Brittany's continued employment in the kitchen, and a clause that ensured I could decline invitations to stay overnight without repercussion. He agreed to it. We talked about boundaries until they were clear in the way a map becomes clear when the paths are labeled. When I signed, I felt the work of my life pivot. Signing was not an act of submission. It was one of pragmatic clarity. The house would employ me in a way that acknowledged my skills and paid me for time I had given away for so long. It would also mark me as someone visible in a different ledger, the house's staff list rather than just a hand that smoothed napkins. The moment the ink dried, Giovanni folded the contract and put it into a drawer as casually as if he had placed another file into a cabinet. The formality of the act soothed something inside me that had been raw. The months that followed were an odd mixture of domestic stillness and external tremor. I would go to work at the mansion, my tasks now including correspondence for Giovanni, simple clerical things that allowed me to see the machinery behind his empire in a way that did not romanticize it. I typed letters he dictated about zakat and property. I scheduled a philanthropic meeting where he discussed the restoration of a community garden in Naples. These small administrative acts made me feel as if I were inside the gears, rather than merely the grease on them. At night, when the house was quiet and the city was itself again, we had dinners that were ordinary, and then not. We shared thoughts on small books and on recipes for pasta sauce he liked. He told me more of his history, not to excuse but to explain. A childhood where the street taught lessons in survival. A father who had been a man of strict codes. A funeral where the boy realized that grief could be an inheritance as well. He was not a man who explained himself to make guilt assume the face of softness. He showed tenderness in the precision of his attention. I also learned the price of his decisions. When the city woke with a news cycle that hinted at a power shift, businesses shuttered, certain men missing, a quiet that hung over particular neighborhoods, there was a collective intake of breath. I felt the weight of it, the way a stone feels different in your pocket after you know what it might crush. There were consequences. Krasniki found some of his operations weakened. Other people in the city rearranged their habits. Fear did what it always does. It asked for no proof to be believed. People closed earlier, avoided certain bars, watched the street with new circumspection. One morning, I sat on the terrace with a cup of coffee as the dawn turned the city a thin sheet of silver. A neighbor across the way pulled down their shutters. A news van idled by a block over, then moved on. Giovanni stood beside me, looking at the city as if reading a map no one had given him. He slipped his hand into mine, an unremarkable contact that, in that hour, felt enormous. "You asked the question once," I said to him, the memory of that evening like a stone in my throat. "You asked me, who did this?" And everything shifted. He turned to me. "Yes," he said. He sounded both tired and steady. "Asking can be another kind of ordering. It makes the world answer." "And now?" I asked. "Who will answer for the ripple, for what they took?" He did not say the men would be made whole. He said the world is not tidy, and the house can only assume so much. He spoke of limits, of what protection meant in practice and in principle. He promised to honor the terms we had discussed. No parading, no showing. He promised to respect what I had kept as mine, my apartment, my job, my sister. That promise, offered and kept, was its own kind of restitution. There was a moment when the house and the city collided. Krasniki's men made an error, an overreach that drew attention, a public slur at a cafe that resulted in a confrontation answered by people who did not work in the law, but worked in another kind of order. The papers called it an escalation, and for a week the city felt like it balanced on the head of a pin. Shops on certain avenues boarded up in anticipation. Bars changed their hours. The tremor was unmistakable. The fallout was not only exterior, it worked into the staff room where jokes felt thin and the laughter brittle. Rosa told me one evening as she soured a pan with lemon that houses like ours always sit on a seam. "You are in a different place now," she said, and I heard in her voice the memory of women whose lives had been rearranged by similar storms. Brittany, who had been until then my simple, practical confidant, asked me if I was happy. Her question was less about the luxury of the mansion, and more about whether I felt like myself. I had to admit that at times my identity felt distributed between my apartment and the guest room we had made mine. Brittany held my hand and said nothing for a long time. It was a solidarity that was louder than any speech. The scars on my face faded, but other marks remained. Wary flashes when I walked certain streets. A tighter breath now and then when I thought of the men who had made a choice to harm me. There were nights when I woke and reached for a presence that used to be, in my old life, indifferent. Now it was a complicated presence that held both safety and the weight of consequences. The love that grew was not the kind of pure thing you find in novels. It came mixed with ledger entries and small meetings and calls from accountants, and it asked for negotiation every step of the way. One afternoon, a layer of the past crept back in. An old friend from the agency called. someone who had known me before the house, before Giovanni's attention. He asked, without malice, how I had come by the new job. When I explained, I felt the old shame like a phantom limb. "Is it safe?" he asked. "Does it buy you what you need?" There was a sting in the question. I answered with the facts, benefits, a schedule, security measures. But the truth that my life could be described in sentences like those also tasted odd. There were moments that required re-anchoring. I would walk to my apartment at times and sit on my own stoop, feeling the city in its roughness. I would count the bills and make plans that had nothing to do with Giovanni's world. A small deposit for a worn couch, a new kettle for the kitchen, Brittany's grocery list. These small acts felt like reclaiming the life I had not given away. At the same time, the mansion had become part of that life. I found myself placing a photograph of my mother next to the desk, where I now organized invoices, as if making the two worlds speak to one another. The slow arc of days carried us to a quieter settlement. Krasniki's influence had waned in certain circles. Men who once walked with a certain swagger now crossed the street to avoid conflict. The city's fear had been answered with a message. Certain boundaries were not to be crossed. But the victory was not clean. There were losses on both sides. Businesses that had closed, reputations damaged, families who paid in other currencies. I learned to see the cost, and to feel a complicated grief for what the answer to "who did this?" had demanded. In the softness that followed, Giovanni and I found more room to be known to one another. We traveled once, briefly, to Naples, just him and me, and the thin thread of his childhood. The trip was not a romantic escape full of cinematic revelations. It was a pragmatic visit he had to make, a way to settle an account, and to visit an old friend who had been a neighbor. For me, the city was a contrast. Sea breeze and laundry flapping like flags on lines, a familiarity in the language that clung to his speech. We walked along a narrow street where a woman sold lemons, and he told me about the funeral again, about how a boy had stood in a crowd and learned that a man could be lonely even while surrounded by others. In Naples, my fears felt smaller for a moment. The kitchen where his aunt had cooked for him was loud and full of voices. Food was served in plates that did not care about propriety. It felt like an ordinary life, at least for the time it lasted. He introduced me to a cousin who smiled easily, and to a neighbor who remembered him as a child. I watched him in his old world and felt a tenderness that was not only desire, but recognition. He was, in Naples, less of a title and more of a man who had been shaped by tides and small cruelties. When we returned, life resumed its rhythms. My 6-week healing period ended with a gradual return to full movement. Dr. Caruso signed off on my work with a list of cautions and an assurance that with gradual strengthening, I could resume regular duties. I kept 3 sessions of physical therapy, each one a small triumph, lifting a pot without a catch in my breath, carrying a basket of laundry down the stairs without feeling like the world shifted. Then came the final reckoning of the streets. Krasniki, whose name had loomed like an omen, found his power diminished through a series of private blows. I heard about it in fragments. A safe house found abandoned. A lieutenant decided to leave and move his business elsewhere. An associate who chose to take a different path rather than continue a war. The city adjusted. Some of the shops reopened. People walked with a less guarded gait. Fear had been answered for now, but the city had been altered. For me, the personal outcomes were concrete. The hospital account that had once been a mountain was cleared in a way that allowed the shoebox under my bed to be folded away. The money was not charity. It was a clearing of a ledger that allowed me and my family to breathe. Giovanni arranged for my mother's remaining payments to be managed in a manner that did not humiliate her with phone calls. Brittany received an offer for more hours in the mansion kitchen, and the cooks praised her for how she turned a stock pot into an act of grace. These were small miracles threaded through the ordinary. I remember the day I told my mother that her bills were handled. She laughed in a way that was disbelief, and then gratitude all at once. There were tears, of course, hers and mine, and in that moment I felt a center of gravity shift. It was not salvation, not absolution, but it was a clearing that gave us air. The final weeks before we settled into our new lives were a sequence of negotiations and small agreements. I insisted on one absolute. I would never be his secret or his trophy. I would keep autonomy. He insisted on one counterpoint. He would protect me. Those were not contradictory positions. They were the terms of a fragile bargain we made daily. Love, when it announced itself, did so in many small ways. There were mornings where he would sit on the chaise in the library and read aloud from an old book while I folded linens nearby. There were nights when he would bring me a cup of tea and a cloth to warm my hands, and I would touch the back of his hand as if testing its reality. There were conversations about future plans, not the grand kind, but the practical ones. A visit to our mother, a Sunday meal that involved both of our families, a garden to plant in a shared courtyard. He asked once if I wanted to help supervise a small charitable program he was starting for women in the neighborhood who worked as domestic staff. The invitation felt like an offering of trust more than benevolence. I accepted. Consent remained a living practice. There were times when he would ask if I was comfortable with a public appearance, and I would say no, because I wanted privacy. He never took offense. There were nights when I would be afraid that I would become the public symbol of a private war, and he held me without trying to fix my fear. He learned to be patient. I learned slowly not to feel guilty for accepting kindness. The balance we found was unnatural in some ways and utterly human in others. We built, in those months, a life that was not exempt from danger, but resilient to it. I kept my apartment. Brittany kept her job. My mother's bills were managed. Giovanni declined certain expansions he had once considered, not out of fear, but out of a new priority. He chose to keep his world contained. Perhaps it was because he had learned what cost looked like up close, or perhaps because he had decided that some things were worth preserving over the hunger for more. Whatever the reason, his decision altered trajectories beyond our two lives. I remember an evening when a neighbor's child came to the mansion with a scraped knee. Giovanni personally arranged for a bandage and a small cup of cocoa, and when the parents thanked him, he brushed the gratitude away like it was a small thing. That moment, trivial in many accounts, felt like evidence of how the house now moved in the world. It was less about power as spectacle and more about stewardship. In the epilogue of that long, complicated season, there was a steadying day when everything looked possible without being safe. It was a morning of quiet light. The terrace was washed in a flat silver, and the city hummed with the life of people making coffee and paper deliveries. Giovanni and I stood side by side, not as an owner and an employee, but as two people who had negotiated a life that kept both their vulnerabilities and their wills intact. I asked the question that night, he said, voice low, as if naming a wound. Who did this? You did more than ask, I said. You answered, in your way. He smiled, a small, private thing. Who does this belong to now? He asked. I thought about the men who had hurt me, about the city that had tightened around its fears, about the ledger of debts paid and of choices made. I thought about my mother's shoebox, now folded away, and about Brittany's steady hands turning vegetables into small domestic miracles. I thought about the contract I had signed, and the autonomy I had not surrendered. I thought about the cost and the gift. This belongs to many things, I said at last. To consequences, to choices, to people trying to right a small wrong. It belongs to the city that felt fear in the morning and changed its habits because someone refused to be invisible. He took my hand then, fingers interlacing in a way that felt like joining two maps. I will protect the space you choose, he said. I will not erase you. And I will keep my life, I told him. I will be with you because I choose it. We did not promise forever in the way stories like to script. We promised a life in increments, days that belonged to us, boundaries that protected them, and a willingness to face what might come. The city, for its part, settled into a brittle calm. Krasniki's name faded into the margins of a news cycle. The men who had hurt me became a cautionary tale whispered in certain parts of town. Fear had been answered, but not without cost. The house had paid for safety in ways that could be counted in closed businesses and rearranged loyalties. In the months that followed, I found my hands moving with a new steadiness. I threaded linens with a little more attention and less of that invisible fatigue. I answered phones for Giovanni and scheduled meetings. I taught a woman from the neighborhood how to iron a shirt with a crispness that made her smile. When my mother laughed at lunch, I felt the world right again for that moment. Once, late at night, I stood by the study's largest window and watched the city spread out like a sheet of possibility. Giovanni came up behind me and rested his chin on my shoulder. "You are seen," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "I am seen, and I am not alone in being so." He kissed the top of my head in a gesture that was both protective and tender. There was no assumption in it, no claim beyond the simple fact of presence. The question that had changed everything, who did this, had done more than point to a man who had hurt me. It had opened a place for an answer that was messy and true. People will sometimes reach for violence, and people will sometimes respond with something else: protection, restitution, negotiation. None of it leaves the world unmarked. We kept living in the interstices. I kept my apartment and the life that came with it. I worked in the mansion and learned to write a letter in Giovanni's hand that he would sign. Brittany kept her hours at the stove, sending me texts about a recipe that had finally turned out right. Rosa kept watching the perimeter and telling stories in the staff room about women who had been both small and extraordinary. Franco continued to do what loyal men do. His loyalty was a compass rather than a cudgel. The city still had mornings where fear gripped people in a recognizable way. A cab driver who refused a fare at dusk, a shopkeeper who locked up early. But there were also mornings where the city breathed, where the sun pushed through clouds and made the street lamps wink out. Those mornings felt like permission. The ledger of my life had been rewritten. The shoebox that had once held our debts had been folded away. The fracture in my rib had knit. The question that had been asked in a study had become, over time, a motif. Who did this? Who answers when wrong is done? Who pays the bills of the living and the cost of retribution? Giovanni's voice, quiet and exacting, had moved from a demand to a partnership of sorts. He had asked a question that morning and, in the doing of it, had altered the city's rhythms by evening. Fear had gripped the city by morning in the way a ripple can do when a stone is thrown into water. The stone had been my night on the pavement. The question had been his hand picking it up and holding it up for inspection. And the answer had been a messy, costly rearrangement. I had been invisible for 8 months. Then for a long while after, I was visible in different ways. Seen, protected, negotiating, choosing. My life was not a fairy tale untroubled by consequence. It was an arrangement of wills and care and painful reckonings. In the end, the choice I made, to accept help on my terms, to sign a contract that preserved my autonomy, to keep my apartment and my sister and my dignity, was the answer to the question he first asked in the hush of his study. When I think back, it is the morning light I remember most, thin and insistent, making the city look like a place that had weathered a storm and was learning how to go on. Giovanni and I stood on the terrace and watched the city wake. The houses opened their blinds like eyelids. People came into their day. Somewhere else a rumor was born and died. Somewhere else, a man who had once thought to harm had his future narrowed by choices he had made. He turned to me then, and his voice, when it came, was less a question than an acknowledgement. "You are not invisible anymore." "No," I said, watching the city. "But I choose what being seen means." He took my hand, and together we watched the sun make the day possible. The question that had started it all, who did this, had been answered in ways I could live with, not by erasing the cost, but by accounting for it, by paying what could be paid, and by choosing a life that was mine because I had said it was.